All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Albertson. I am still the Deputy Director at the Center for Global Security Research here at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thanks as always for taking the time out of your morning to be with us for our speaker series. And our speaker series today, the CGSR lecture series, is going to present a talk by Dr. Frank Jones, who is a distinguished fellow at the U.S. Army War College. And his talk today is titled Obama and the Bomb, New Start, Russia and the Politics of Post-Cold War Arms Control. And the title of the talk also happens to be the title of Frank's recent book of the same topic. And I will put the link to that book in the chat as we get started. But we had, this conversation last week in the lecture series with Mallory Stewart about sort of what comes next after New Start expiration, highlighting for those who weren't on that talk last week. So the New START Treaty was the sort of last big significant bilateral strategic arms control treaty between us and the Russians. This was a legacy that dated back to the late 60s, early 70s, sort of a line of bilateral strategic arms control limitations and reduction talks. But it expired at the beginning of this month on February 5th or 6th, depending on who you ask. It had been in effect for 10 years and then had been extended for an additional 5 years. But after that, the treaty expired. It was not allowed to be extended more, although there was some talk about how do we keep certain things about the treaty in place. But it is gone. So it is a very useful time to sort of look back on the history of the agreement, how it got done in the first place, because now the central challenge is, well, what do we do next? How do you build a new agreement? How do you negotiate a new agreement? And I think sort of over the sands of time, people have sort of looked back and been said, well, New START was easy. We wanted it, the Russians wanted it, we had a reset policy, some people went over to Geneva for a few months and everything magically happened and we got an arms control agreement. And so let's just do that again. But I think if you read Frank's book and you listen to Frank talk today, I think you'll hear it's enormously complicated and enormously hard. And anytime you do a negotiation, you need to know what you want. You need to work with the other side. You need to go back and forth. There's a lot of very fraught moments. And there's an important international component to it, but there's also an important domestic component to it of how do you get senators to ratify an agreement. So with that, let me just say a little bit about the speaker. He is a distinguished fellow and professor emeritus of security studies at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he taught at the Department of National Security and Strategy for more than 14 years. Previously, he retired from the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy as a career member of the Senior Executive Service after more than 30 years of federal service, including as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army. His research focuses on the formation and implementation of U.S. national security policy and strategy in the Cold War. He's the author and editor of numerous books, as well as numerous chapters in various publications. He earned his PhD from the School of Government and International Relations, Griffith University, Queensland, Australia. And with that, Frank, just enormously excited to have you here for this talk. Like I said, I'll put a link to your book in the chat, and over to you as Mariah pulls your slides up.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for this invitation. I appreciate that. I appreciate the work of the center as well and getting me into this opportunity. And I want to thank those of you who are watching the presentation wherever you are. Thank you for taking time from your schedule to listen to me this morning or afternoon, as the case may be, to talk about my book. So if you go to the next slide, please. So this is the outline of the topics I'm going to talk about this morning or this afternoon. I'll start with the research question. I'll talk about why President Obama was interested in arms control and in this particular attempt to really define and develop a follow-on treaty to the START treaty, the Strategic Reduction Arms Control Treaty that came into being in the early 1990s. I'll talk about the strategic context in which he and his administration worked on this particular treaty. I'll try to frame it in a larger context of the Russian reset policy, the external environment first, and as well as the idea of actually meeting with his counterpart, President Medvedev, and then the Prague agenda, which the Prague speech really is the kickoff, if you will, of this treaty. And then I'll talk about some of the contending concerns, because although we might think of treaties as discrete in one respect, it also contends with other issues. And there were two that were particularly pertinent at this time. One was the nuclear posture review, the congressionally mandated review. And the second one was the European missile defense, the idea of defending NATO allies, American forces, American citizens in Europe against Iranian long-range missiles. I'll talk briefly about the negotiations, the Senate action, which is, as Brad mentions, as Mike mentions, very important to understanding the role of the Senate constitutionally, and then some conclusions. Next one, please. So the question I was asking myself is, how did the president and his administration use negotiation and ratification of the Arms Control Treaty, that is what becomes the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, as a vehicle for advancing one of his primary policy objectives, and that's the reset of the U.S. relations with Russia. And then how did they translate the president's vision into a policy, and it was very much a high priority, and then negotiate successfully? And then what factors did I think contributed to this successful outcome? And I looked at a few based upon previous treaties, reading memoirs, etc., that would give me some sense of what a framework might look like in terms of the factors that contributed to the successful outcome. Next slide, please. So President Obama's interest in arms control begins very early. Begins when he's a student, undergraduate student at Columbia University. He takes a course in presidential decision-making and foreign policy. And during the first semester, they studied that particular topic, and he becomes very interested in Cuban Missile Crisis. And you can see by the year 1982, 83, this is the beginning of President Reagan's military defense buildup. So there's a lot of interest in arms negotiation, arms control, but there's also a buildup in terms of capacity or military capability of the United States. And in the second semester, Barack Obama writes a paper on how to reduce US-Soviet nuclear arsenals. And that becomes the genesis of his thinking. But as you know, he doesn't follow through with this from a political standpoint or from a career standpoint after he graduates from Columbia. Goes into community organizing. But then again, he becomes interested in political office, the nuclear terrorism, because of the events of 9/11, September 11th, 2001, influences ideas. He begins to think about those. And that becomes part of his understanding as he runs for the Senate. And it will have an impact on his thinking as he becomes a candidate for the presidency. Once he is elected to the Senate in 2004 election, he comes under the mentorship of Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana. Senator Lugar is a very famous internationalist, if you will, very interested in arms control, had worked with Senator Sam Nunn on the cooperative threat reduction legislation. And he becomes if you will, a protege of Senator Lugar in terms of arms control. President Obama, then Senator Obama, joins the Foreign Relations Committee. He travels on the annual trip that Lugar would make to Russia each year. And then he begins to formulate his own ideas about nuclear nonproliferation. You can see there's a mention of a bill in 2007, which co-sponsors with Senator Chuck Hagel of Nebraska. And then in 2007, he's running for the presidency. He begins to outline his nuclear policy as a presidential candidate. And all of this is influenced by these experiences, but also by the thinking that's surrounding him in terms of the people that are on his committee backing him up as advisors as he's running for the presidency. And he's also influenced by what Time magazine called the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That would be Henry Kissinger, Senator Sam Nunn, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, and also former Secretary of State George Shultz, who have written a number of pieces in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere about arms control and the future of arms control. Next slide, please. So what is the context for arms control and nuclear strategy and nuclear weaponry as 2008, as the George W. Bush presidency lasts for 8 years? What's occurring here? Next slide, please. So as you may recall, there was a treaty, a very brief treaty called the Moscow Treaty, or the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty, SORT, signed in 2002. But at the same time, a month later, the United States withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty that had been agreed to back in the early 1970s under President Nixon. Surprisingly, the Russians were very judicious in the response to that withdrawal. But over the next 6 years, that relationship between the United States and Russia begins to fray. It begins to erode, primarily because of the Bush administration's advocacy for admitting Ukraine and Georgia to NATO in 2008. And then there's the invasion of Georgia, and the United States provides economic and humanitarian assistance to Georgia during that period of time. And then in August of 2008, the Bush administration announces plans to deploy a ballistic missile defense system consisting of some ground-based interceptors in Poland and a tracking radar in the Czech Republic for the purposes of defending NATO allies, U.S. forces, and American citizens in NATO against Iranian ballistic missiles, long-range ballistic missiles. This is very upsetting to the Russians, despite the remarks by the Bush administration that this would be aimed at Iran. Russians are not convinced of it. They see this as a way to undermine their strategic deterrent. In November 2008, a year before the START treaty, or START 1 treaty, expires, the United States proposes a follow-on treaty to that, and Russia rejects it. It's described in some literature as a mix of START and SORT. And as you know, November 2008 is the election year, and the Russians decide that they will not go forward with any more discussions. They'll wait to see what the Obama administration offers. Next slide, please. Next slide. So what is the Obama administration faced with? It's faced with the idea that what President Obama himself characterizes the relationship by the time he enters office as really a dangerous drift. And the reset policy is framed around this objective of cooperation in areas where there's common interests. And at the top of that list is arms control. But as the slide depicts, there are many other issues that the President of the United States believes that can be worked on in some type of cooperative framework. First, sanctions on Iran, as Iran is developing not only ballistic missiles, but also a nuclear program. North Korea has already started a nuclear program and is well advanced in it, and there's that concern as well. Then there are economic issues, particularly Russia's accession to the World Trade Organization. There's an interest in military-to-military cooperation, a topic that's been in the news recently. And then there are a number of various trade and investment and business initiatives that the United States is interested in, really reacting to the global recession, as you remember, and Russia is suffering from that same global impact of that economic crisis. So that is the reset policy, and it frames anything else that's below it in terms of how the United States will relate to Russia regarding policy. Next slide, please. So what does President Obama really think about arms control at this point? Well, he does favor progressive nuclear disarmament, but he's very aware of the domestic politics that he has to deal with in terms of how many votes could he get actually for a treaty if he were to have an arms control treaty. And then he has to reassure the allies, that the NATO allies in particular, that the United States remains committed to its defense, the NATO's allied defense, and the realities of dealing with that and the sensitivities psychologically and otherwise that that entails. At the same time, it's been a number of years, more than a decade and a half, since there's been an arms control treaty. What's the expertise in the U.S. Senate, not only among senators, but also among their staffs? Meanwhile, there have been a number of studies done by the Defense Department and others, including non-governmental organizations, indicating that the national security enterprise needs to be modernized, that there's been an underinvestment in that over the years since the end of the Cold War. And he's also very mindful that the Bush administration plan for European ballistic missile defense has very much bipartisan congressional support, both in the House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate. So taking that all together, he's recognizing there's both an international element to this, and there is also a domestic element that has to be dealt with. Next slide, please. So if I were to draw a graphic of this as I have, then the Russian reset really is the larger frame for this. And within this sits the new arms control treaty, this follow-on to START. But that too is impinged upon by the European ballistic missile defense plan that President Bush had initiated, the nuclear posture review, the congressionally mandated review to look out 5 to 10 years in terms of nuclear strategy and policy, the interest in nuclear modernization that exists in the Senate in particular, but also in the House of Representatives, and then this concept of prompt global strike, the conventionally armed strategic range weapon systems, systems that can deliver a precision-guided conventional weapon anywhere in the world within an hour in a manner similar to an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile. So those other three areas are not only of interest in domestic politics, but the Russians are very concerned about the European ballistic missile defense, as I mentioned, and they're also worried about prompt global strike, what the capability is, how that might influence their strategic deterrent. Next slide, please. So the beginning really of the discussion of a new arms control begins early in the administration. Only a few months after his inauguration, President Obama meets with his counterpart in London, and they produce two joint communiques, statements. One outlines that broad reset policy, the broad goals of how they will build bilateral cooperation over the next few years. And the second is this idea of the follow-on arms control treaty. And they agree that there will be a reduction in limitation, but of strategic offensive arms. The numbers will be something lower than the Moscow Treaty numbers. I'll get to that later. There must be effective verification measures. They're drawing from the experience of implementing the START Treaty. And then the negotiators of the two sides are to report their progress on a summit in July of 2009. And in the back of the minds of the president and the Russian counterpart is the fact that START 1 is going to expire early December. So how much time do they really have to negotiate this? A matter of months, actually. This is information that's communicated. These statements are communicated, but the real communication of the larger idea of nuclear weapons and how the administration will shape their policy comes later, only a few days later. Next slide, please. It comes during a speech that President Obama gives in Prague. And as you can see from the slide, there's quite a gathering of people, about estimated crowd of about 30,000 people in Prague as he delivers his first major foreign policy address. And he makes two, I think, very important aspects to this. One, that the United States will take, and it says, concrete steps towards a world without nuclear weapons. But he caveats that as well and says, since the nuclear weapons exist, the United States will maintain a safe, secure, and effective arsenal to deter any adversary and guarantee that defense to our allies. So he's talking about extended deterrence and other commitments made under the North Atlantic Treaty on which NATO was set up. And he again reiterates that the U.S. will negotiate a new strategic arms reduction treaty with the Russians by the end of the year. Again, shooting for that treaty to be perhaps signed and doubtful that it'll be ratified by December 5th. Next slide, please. So what is this? What is the agenda that he's talking about? Because it's just, as I said, it's more than just the nuclear aspect. There's, in his mind, still this concern about preventing nuclear terrorism and promoting nuclear security. He wants to strengthen the non-proliferation regime through the non-proliferation treaty. He wants to support a peaceful energy use. And as he says in his speech, he wants to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. security policy. But as I mentioned, there are contending concerns. Next slide, please. The nuclear posture review is congressionally mandated, and there's the understanding that this document would be produced in 2009 or 2010, sometime around that period. And so while the posture review is occurring, the negotiations will begin. And so there's this period of adjustment that has to be here while the negotiations occurring, the nuclear posture review is ongoing. Secondly, the Defense Department, which will have the lead for the posture review, has to consult with the Department of Energy, and it also, the Authorization Act, the National Defense Authorization Act, requires DoD to also conduct it in consultation with the Department of State. There are also two other reviews going on. There is a quadrennial defense review occurring, and there's a 2010 ballistic missile defense review that is occurring. And there's an expectation on the part of the Congress that the administration will consult on these documents with the U.S. Congress and allies. Now, the language for, if you go to the next slide, please. The language here is, as you can see, quite comprehensive. They'll look at nuclear strategy and planning. They'll look at the nuclear weapons complex, the labs, the production of other facilities, and its modernization. They'll look at the composition, the levels of the delivery systems, relationship among deterrence policy, targeting strategy, and arms control, the stockpile, the impact of missile defense capabilities, and then the policy requirements and goals to maintain that safe, reliable, and credible nuclear deterrence posture. So those are the requirements that the Congress establishes in the 2008 National Defense Authorization Act. And it's quite, as you can see, it's very much an integration of all of these concerns that the Congress has about modernization, size of the arsenal, whether the aging of the actual complex, the type of weapon systems that might be needed in the near term, 5 to 10 years in advance, etc. So all of this is going on, and all of those aspects must be considered by the Defense Department and other agencies, but particularly defense and state and energy, excuse me. Next slide, please. So from this comes a framework that the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, puts together. And again, it's tied to the Prague agenda, as you can see, and also with the discussion about how the administration wants to consider arms control within the larger context of the Russian reset and also national security policy. So it'll look at preventing nuclear proliferation and terrorism, again, tying it back to the president's speech, the reducing the role of U.S. nuclear weapons, but at the same time, maintaining strategic deterrence and stability, but at reduced nuclear force levels. Again, strengthening regional deterrence. Read into that European BMD and reassuring the allies and partners as a result of that. And then going back to the president's speech, again, that willingness to sustain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal. Next slide, please. So the perception, at least among the Russians and perhaps many others, is that the United States holds the technological edge regarding missile interceptors. And to be more specific about what this missile defense plan looked like from the Bush administration perspective, is they proposed placing this system in Poland. Again, this was a plan, ground-based interceptors. And in the Czech Republic, there would be radar, or tracking radar. And as it was stated multiple times by both the Bush administration and later by the Obama administration, was to counter the Iranian capability. In the midst of this process, again, as the NPR is occurring, the National Posture Review is occurring, as the negotiations are going on, the president Obama decides that they're going to propose something different. And they do that in September of 2009. So here we are in the midst of the negotiations, and they're going to propose something called the European Phased Adaptive Approach, EPAA. And they're going to use the Standard Missile 3 on the Aegis ships to deal with short and medium range, because it's been a change in the intelligence assessment by the United States about what Iranian capability is. And they're going to locate the radar in Turkey, a NATO ally. And this causes great consternation at first among some members of Congress, particularly in the Senate, who see this as backtracking, as a getting into the Russians, because the Russians had opposed, as I said, they had a great deal of qualms about this particular plan that the United States had proposed, at least during the Bush administration. And some of them see this as the United States going back on its agreement. But there had been no ratification of agreement with Poland and the Czech Republic about actually putting those interceptors and radar in systems in their countries. Next slide. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the negotiations. The negotiations run for about 11 months, depending on how you wish to count this. And there are numerous times when there is progress, and there are times when there is very scant agreement on how to proceed. And it requires a great deal of persistence, requires patience, and it requires a willingness to understand the other party's perspective on these issues. But as the negotiations began after April, and there's a period of feeling each other out, if you will, about parties doing that, there has to be an understanding of what they're trying to do here with a new follow-on to start. That's what it's called, a follow-on treaty to start. Doesn't get the title New Start until much later. So if you go to the next slide, please. So how are they framing this? Well, they're framing it to understand it within the context of what already exists. The first one is START 1, or the original START, signed by President George H.W. Bush in 1991, that enters into force in 1994, that will expire in 2009. And as you can see from the bullets there, significant reduction in stockpiles, mandated certain limits on intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, heavy bombers, number of warheads, very robust verification provision, including short notice and planned inspections, on-site inspections. And then there was the 2002 Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty, which the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, had signed in 2002 and entered into force a year later. And they're limiting there were unilateral decisions. In fact, there had been a nuclear posture review that came out in 2001, in which Secretary Rumsfeld, it was a classified NPR, but Secretary Rumsfeld talked about the reductions, why those reductions could occur, this idea of a new triad, the building of an important ballistic missile defense capability for the United States, etc. And so there was a belief that by the Bush administration that they could actually get lower, excuse me, by the Obama administration that they could actually get the warheads lower beyond 1,700 as a low level number. They were, though, reliant upon the 1991 START Treaty to remain in force because it had that existing verification provisions. There were none in the Moscow Treaty. And so that is one of the elements that they were particularly concerned about keeping and having continued in the follow-on treaty. Now, as you can imagine, the preparation for negotiations requires the creation of an organizational structure, and that entails not only the president's sponsorship, if you will, but the interagency of the State Department, Defense, Energy, the intelligence community, and others. Vice President Biden at the time was very much involved, as was his staff. You have the cabinet officers and their organizational staffs. The negotiation delegation itself, consisting of the interagency players, backstoppers, people in Washington that are there to provide technical advice and other types of advice. And then you have to have the analytical process. And the Obama administration decides that they will use the Bush administration targeting guidance and Secretary Gates' guidance on the employment of nuclear weapons. And they've already conducted a review of current planning guidance and nuclear war plans. And so they have to fold that into the ongoing nuclear posture review as well and make some decisions about how this process will unfold. So the president has initiated it. He appoints a chief negotiator, the Honorable Rose Gottemuller, who will be the chief negotiator, and then she will have a number of lead negotiators from the Office of Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Department of State, and the intelligence community. And then there will be negotiations and then reaching a conclusion before it'll go to the Senate for ratification should the negotiations be successfully concluded. Now, in any negotiation, there is not only the composition of the negotiating delegation and the relationship between the principal, the president, and the agents that are acting on, in this case, his behalf. There are the behind-the-table challenges of the interagency and being together, if you will, on cooperating on the interagency basis so that they can go forward with a closely aligned attitude about how this should unfold. There's influencers, internal and external. Of course, while the negotiations are going on, non-governmental organizations are interested. Media is interested. There are internal influences, whether they be on the U.S. side or the Russian side. And then, of course, there are the means of negotiations in terms of incentives, concessions, and costs. And the use of the media, though, I have to say that both Ms. Gottmuller and her Russian counterpart are really circumspect about how much messaging and how much talking they do that gets out into the media and becomes public. And then on top of that, you have to think about the structure. What are the issues? What's the information that both sides have available? What are the key milestones and events that are going to drive the action? The process itself, the way the process has been set up, including location and agenda setting. And then the linkage, the relationship of the current negotiations to other negotiations. And as I mentioned here on this slide, the other past negotiations that have an impact on this one. And so there's an opportunity here for negotiation to consider their objectives, the negotiators, the role of the negotiator, and then the strategy. Defining the aims, the issue strategy, defining the process strategy, And then the timing strategy, this timing and the phasing of negotiation and the interplay of the parties that are involved. Next slide, please. I won't go into a lot of detail over the negotiations. As I said, they take about 11 months. And there is periods where there's success. There are periods where, in beginning with they're touching noses, if you will. The first time, touching noses is a term that Rose Gottmuller uses. It's the first encounter between the negotiators. There's meetings in May, and the first round of negotiations really begins in May in Moscow, and then it moves to Geneva and follows on in Moscow, all in preparation for, as you may recall, the two presidents agreed that they would have a summit in July to take stock of where they were in terms of the negotiations. So what are some of the issues they're trying to really flesh out over the course of these 10 months or so? The United States is very interested and very cognizant of trying to learn from START 1. And they're listening to the interagency and trying to determine what areas they might seek to have some success in terms of this new follow-on. One is to prevent flushings. The Russians, there was a concern that they had been moving mobile missiles, particularly those that are on vehicles, from inspection sites when inspection notification was made. That was called flushing. And therefore they were hidden, and there was concerns about that. Bomber counting rules. How should bombers be counted? It had been a long-standing issue, and what bombers were going to be counted had been an issue during the START negotiations. The freedom to mix, that each party might determine the mix of warheads it wants to deploy, rather than having sub-limits within limits, the central limits. And then there was a concern, particularly by both the Russians and the United States, about the on-site inspections. They become owners. They're owners in terms of cost. They're owners in terms of the impact that they have when their inspections are going on and how that affects operational tempo, how it detracts people, wings, missile wings, or others from doing their job on a day-to-day basis. And so they wanted to streamline those, and they wanted to reduce the number of inspections. There was also a concern about how to really make sure that there was an identification of each ICBM, SLBM, and heavy bomber. And there would be an innovative idea, a unique identifier using the serial numbers that would eventually be agreed to. I think probably the most important aspect of success, or at least one of the most important aspects of this success, is the negotiators. And by those negotiators, I mean the leaders. I mean the two presidents are personally involved. There's dozens of phone calls between the two of them. There are summits. There are meetings at the margins of other multilateral meetings. And there's also the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mullen, and his counterpart, Russian General Makarov, as obstacle removers, sitting down face to face and trying to find ways around areas where stalemate had occurred. At the same time, the negotiators and the people in Washington, as well as in Moscow, are considering what for Americans are the third rails. Prompt global strike, this conventional system, this capability to strike a target within an hour or less than an hour, and the European BMD. Those were ever more mindful of both the negotiators and the people in Washington. As I mentioned, there's a series of rounds of negotiation through 2009. There's a summit between the president and the two presidents in Moscow. And in September 2009, the Obama administration announces European adaptive approach to the new ballistic missile defense program. In September through October and November of 2009, there's some negotiations in Geneva. There's a discussion of the verification process. And then there's a meeting in November with Admiral Mullen and General Makarov, and they meet, and it's not as a success as we wanted, but at least it's a beginning of a dialogue between these two men. And unfortunately, on December 5th, 2009, START expires. So there is no new follow-on to START. I would also mention that in November, two members of the Senate, Senator Dianne Feinstein and Senator John Kyle, Feinstein, a Democrat, Kyle, a Republican, come to Geneva to observe as part of the National Security Working Group, a Senate group that's involved in, I won't say involved, that's there to understand what's going on and in Geneva and see what the progress on the talks occurs. And that has an impact as well, because they make some recommendations back to through Undersecretary Tosser, who's the Undersecretary of State for International Security Arms Control issues, and she has a good relationship with Senator Feinstein, and the two of them discuss the problem of telemetry or telemetric information. In January, there's another meeting between Mullen and Makarov. There's a belief that there's going to be progress made. At the same time, the president's meeting in Copenhagen the month before to try to again get some traction going on. The February and March timeframe, the negotiations resume. And there's also a period there in February in which it almost looks like this negotiation is going to end. And it comes because of the concerns that the Russians have over European ballistic missile defense and wanting to have language about ballistic missile defense in the treaty itself. But the treaty is successfully concluded in March and 26th of 2010. And as a result of that, the presidents announced that they have a proposal. Next slide, please. I have a treaty, excuse me. So what are the terms of this new treaty? Under the terms, the United States and Russia agreed to make the following arms reductions over a 7-year period. You can see the limit on the warheads. There's a combined limit of 800 launchers, whether they're deployed and non-deployed launchers, and heavy bombers. A separate limit on deployed ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers equipped. Those are bombers equipped with nuclear armaments. And then they have a strong monitoring and verification measures, verification regime to confirm the size and location of those nuclear forces. And that consists, as the slide indicates, data exchanges, nuclear forces, notifications, and on-site inspections. The presidents will sign that in Prague, that treaty on Prague, April 8th, 2010. And in May of 2010, May 13th, the president submits the treaty and other related documents to the Senate for its consideration. Next slide, please. At the same time that this is occurring, the Nuclear Posture Review is released in April as well. Next slide, please. And it outlines U.S. policy for the role of nuclear weapons. And as you notice, the first one is about not using or threatening to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states that are party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and only use it in extreme circumstances to defend its vital interests of the United States, its allies or partners. And its principal role is to deter nuclear attack of the United States, its allies and partners. So that's the U.S. policy promulgated in the NPR. Next slide, please. But it also addresses nuclear modernization, and it recognizes the need to modernize the nuclear arsenal and the production facilities, and I guess one would say the whole nuclear weapons complex. In the NPR, there is a direction for the Navy to develop a new class of submarine, that will be the Columbia class. They're to begin a formal assessment of alternatives to replace the nuclear-capable air-launched cruise missile carried by the B-52. And then they begin initial study of an alternative to the Minuteman III and affirmed that their ongoing programs to extend the current service life until 2030 would continue. So that's the direction that the Defense Department has regarding the future of the triad. Next slide, please. So what is the Senate action? The Senate receives, as I said, the treaty and the other accompanying documents in May of 2010. Of course, this now, as it turns to a different phase, this is where executive and legislative relations are important. There are going to be partisan issues here, ideological differences, and even relationships on committees, which will take place. And there are 3 committees that are involved in this. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee has primary jurisdiction, but ever since the SALT 2 days, the Senate Armed Service Committee will have a role, as well as the Senate's Intelligence Committee. Next slide, please. There remains a number of concerns. These concerns are articulated by several senators. They're concerned about the BMD issue with Europe, the NATO plan, what becomes the NATO plan for them. And their concern there is that it not be included in the treaty. There is some language in the preamble, but that's not legally binding, but yet it does create some problems. There's a concern that global strike, again, will not be eliminated. There's a decided interest in telemetric information being included, although there was a belief that that was not necessary, but ultimately it will be included in the treaty. It is included in the treaty, and as a consequence, that seems as a solve to some of the concerns that were there. There is a great deal of interest in the verification regime, whether it's really as robust as the previous START one had been. There are different concerns about development of new Russian or new kinds of Russian nuclear weapons. And there's also a concern about what were then called tactical nuclear weapons, and because this treaty didn't agree to it, didn't address it. And it wasn't intended to, but that comes up during the discussions, deliberations, and even the debates. And then there is this concern about the triad and the enterprise being modernized. And so the president needs 67 votes, 2/3 of the senators present, in order to vote yay in favor of the treaty. And there will be political trade-offs that he'll have to make. The treaty is referred, as I said, to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Biden, who has had years of experience, is designated as the trail boss to get through it. There are hearings by the Armed Services, the Select Committee on Intelligence, the Foreign Relations Committee. Individual senators and staff are briefed. And the Obama administration begins to conduct public outreach to the media, non-governmental organizations, the American public, and luminaries, former presidents, former secretaries of state, and secretaries of defense, in order to get them on board. And so these hearings in front of the committees last until July. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee reports out favorably on the resolution of ratification in October. Now, remember that the 2010 is a midterm election year, so there's a great deal of consternation whether or not there will be a vote by that year, before year end, because it'll go out of session after December. And so there is a vote to proceed in mid-December, and on December 15th and 22nd, there is the actual floor debate, and the December 26th, there is a Senate vote on the 22nd, in which 71 vote in favor of the treaty, so the 67 is achieved, 26 vote against, and 3 do not vote. And the treaty will enter into force in February 5th, 2011, with this exchange of ratification, instruments of ratification. Next slide, please. So what is this triad, the trillion dollar triad, as it was called? That's the modernization initiatives that gain momentum during ratification. There's a report called the 1215 report. That's the number assigned to the report based upon a section of the National Defense Authorization Act that required the president to set out a 10-year plan for how to modernize the arsenal and the weapons complex. It is part of a bargain that the Obama administration strikes with the Republicans to modernize the three legs of the triad, as well as the lab and production facilities. And there's a resolution, there's a codicil in the resolution of ratification that the president would need to certify his intent to modernize and replace it. Now, of course, out of 10 years plan, he's really committing his successors to this as well. So there are, on the basis of this ratification debate, a formal program record to modernize all three legs of the triad, including that new class of SSBNs, a new bomber, and a new version of the nuclear-armed ACLM, and a new ICBM. Next slide, please. So, as I stated in the beginning, what I was looking at was trying to find some type of framework. What are the factors? And my conclusion was that this treaty, as well as a few others that had been in play and actually been ratified, and therefore had, as Alexander Georgian, a political scientist, said, policy legitimacy, is that there has to be significant political leadership. And at the same time, there has to be an appreciation for how alliance members are going to react to this, because the extended deterrence in this case is of particular importance to NATO allies. Second of all, I don't think you can forget how important the role of the military variables or factors are, and as well as the intelligence considerations. And often, as one of the former negotiators I spoke with told me, really the intelligence often gets short shrift, misunderstood or underappreciated, because it really falls from policy formulation all the way into the monitoring phase. Third, you have to have, negotiators have a skill set that they bring that's very important in terms of understanding the partner across the table, as well as all the people who are backing them up. So that expertise is necessary. Lynn Brooks tells about a case during START, when he was the chief negotiator for START, about how certain expertise was not available to him at a particular point in time, and how that hampered their understanding of how some Navy systems work. And then there's that responsiveness to political trade-offs. The president has to really achieve political consensus, and sometimes if you don't have that supermajority within your own party, in a time when there's polarization, you really need to have the appreciation for how you might get others on the other side of the aisle to join you. Next slide, please. So ultimately, for me, negotiations and treaties are discrete elements of a policy agenda. They're designed, as I say in the slide, to address common concerns where there's a convergence of interests. And each of these treaties is unique. It's negotiated, ratified, it's a formal agreement under an international law. It binds the parties for a period of time. And each side, I believe, it tends to want to even gain a slight competitive advantage. The trade-off between security and transparency, as a set of political scientists, is always ongoing. And then it has to be tied to grand strategy and the president's foreign policy objectives. I think military considerations are paramount. There's often negotiators, cabinet members, and others talk about the predictability, understanding what the other side has in terms of capability, and really imperative for monitoring. And I would say that although the word cooperative is used, I wouldn't use that word. I favor some words that are used by Philip Gulliver, and a cultural anthropologist who studied negotiations, and he talks about competitive antagonism, that is protecting your interests. But on this other side, there's the idea that you have to coordinate your cooperation. You have to give somewhat. You have to cooperate to some degree, and you have to be able to protect your interests. And there's a tension there as well, as there is the tension between transparency and security. But it is about building a competitive advantage. And when you read some of the memoirs of former negotiators, you hear them talk about increments of advantage that they're trying to get. And as Secretary Hillary Clinton said at the time, the nature of these type of agreements are inherently transactional. Well, I appreciate you listening to me regarding the book, and I'm open to questions, any questions you may have, and I'll do my best to answer them as completely as I can. Thank you.